Harlem, New York. It was 2:34 p.m. on Thursday, June 12, 1952, when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's black Cadillac stopped at a red light on Lenox Avenue near 132nd Street, and a small girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, wearing a dress that was too small and too dirty, her face showing the gauntness that comes from chronic hunger, approached the passenger window and tapped on the glass with small, hesitant fingers. Johnson was in the back seat, his driver, William "Quick" Davis, behind the wheel, returning from a meeting with policy operators who paid tribute to Johnson's organization. It was a normal Thursday afternoon in June 1952, hot and humid. Harlem's streets crowded with people going about their business, nothing unusual happening until that small hand tapped on the window. Davis started to wave the child away. Street beggars were common enough, and Johnson's time was too valuable to stop for every person asking for money, but Johnson saw the girl's face through the window and told Davis to roll it down. "Are you Bumpy?" the little girl asked, her voice so quiet that Johnson had to lean forward to hear her clearly. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm Bumpy," Johnson replied, studying the child's face, the hunger written in her hollow cheeks, the desperation in her eyes that no 5-year-old should have to feel. The girl smiled slightly, as if confirming Johnson's identity had relieved some anxiety. "My mama says you're the good guy in town. She says you help people who need help." Johnson felt something tighten in his chest. He was 47 years old in June 1952, one of the most powerful criminals in Harlem, a man who controlled millions of dollars in policy gambling operations, a man who'd survived decades of gang wars and police persecution and prison sentences. He was used to being called many things: criminal, gangster, numbers king, enforcer, but the good guy wasn't a description he heard often, especially not from a child's innocent mouth speaking her mother's words. "Thank you, sweetheart," Johnson said softly. "That's nice of your mama to say." The little girl's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of desperate seriousness that was heartbreaking on such a young face. "But, Mr. Bumpy, my mommy and me are hungry all the time. We don't have enough food, and Mommy says we're going to become homeless soon because she can't pay rent. She cries every night when she thinks I'm sleeping. Mr. Bumpy, can you help us, please?" According to William Davis, who witnessed what happened next, and who spoke with the Harlem Gazette on June 14, 1952, Bumpy Johnson, a man known throughout Harlem for his toughness, his strategic brilliance, his ability to remain calm under pressure that would break most men, looked at that little girl asking for help and slowly began to cry. "I saw a tear roll down Mr. Johnson's face," Davis recalls. "Just one tear at first, then another. Mr. Johnson wasn't sobbing or making noise, but tears were definitely falling. And his face, I'd never seen Mr. Johnson look like that before. He looked devastated, like this little girl's hunger had broken something inside him, that violence and prison and everything else he'd been through had never broken. What Davis didn't know, what the little girl couldn't have known, was that at that precise moment, June 12, 1952, Bumpy Johnson was dealing with a family crisis that had been tearing him apart for months. His biological daughter from his first marriage, Elise Johnson, 28 years old, had recently given birth to a baby girl. But Elise had developed severe heroin addiction, had cut off communication with her father years earlier, and was raising her newborn daughter, Johnson's granddaughter, in conditions that Johnson feared were dangerous and potentially fatal. Looking at the hungry 5-year-old at his car window, Johnson was seeing his own granddaughter's future if he didn't intervene. He was seeing what happened to children whose mothers couldn't provide for them, whose families had fallen apart, whose circumstances made survival itself a daily struggle. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Johnson asked, wiping his eyes quickly. Keisha, the girl said. Keisha Williams. And where do you live, Keisha? The girl pointed to a building half a block away, a tenement that Johnson knew was one of the worst in Harlem, a building where apartments had no heat in winter, where rats were everywhere, where desperate people lived because they had nowhere else to go. Johnson pulled out his wallet, removed several $20 bills, more money than Keisha Williams had probably ever seen in her young life, and handed them to the child. You give this to your mama, okay, Keisha? And you tell her Bumpy Johnson is going to help. You tell her my men are going to come to your apartment tomorrow, and we're going to make sure you have food and that you don't become homeless. Can you remember that? Keisha nodded, clutching the money with both hands, tears now falling from her eyes too. Thank you, Mr. Bumpy, she whispered. Mama was right. You are the good guy. Johnson watched the girl run back toward her building, and then he turned to Davis with an expression Davis had never seen before. Determination mixed with something that looked like desperation. Quick, find out which apartment the Williams family lives in. I want rent paid for the next 2 years. I want food delivered weekly. I want the mother to have a job, find her work at one of our legitimate businesses where she can earn decent money. And I want someone checking on that little girl regularly to make sure she's safe and fed and going to school. Make this happen today. Not tomorrow, today. Yes, sir, Mr. Johnson, Davis said, already pulling the car away from the curb to head back to Johnson's office, where he could begin organizing the help for the Williams family. But as Davis drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that Johnson was still crying silently, tears rolling down his face while he stared out the window at Harlem streets. Mr. Johnson, are you all right? Davis asked carefully. Johnson didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My granddaughter was born 3 weeks ago, Quick. Her name is Margaret. Her mother, my daughter Elise, is a heroin addict. I haven't seen Elise in 2 years because she won't talk to me, won't accept my help, just keeps using heroin and destroying herself. And now she's got a baby, and I don't know if that baby is being fed properly or kept safe or being raised in conditions that any child deserves. Looking at that little girl, Keisha, seeing her hunger, her desperation, all I could think was, that's Margaret's future if I don't save her. That's what's going to happen to my granddaughter if her mother keeps using heroin and I don't intervene. Davis drove in silence for a moment, then said quietly, We'll help the Williams girl, Mr. Johnson, and we'll find your daughter and your granddaughter. We'll make sure both children are safe. I hope you're right, Quick, Johnson said, still staring out the window, because I've got a feeling we're running out of time. At 7:30 p.m. on June 12, 1952, Bumpy Johnson arrived home to his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, where his wife, Mamie Johnson, was preparing dinner. Mamie immediately noticed that something was wrong. Bumpy's eyes were red from crying. His usual confidence was replaced by visible distress. Bumpy, what happened? Mamie asked, abandoning her cooking to sit beside her husband on their living room couch. According to Mamie's later account to close friends, Bumpy told her about the little girl at the car window, about the tears he couldn't control, about his fears for his granddaughter Margaret. My men found out more information today, Bumpy said quietly. Elise gave birth 3 weeks ago to a girl named Margaret. The father is unknown, probably one of the addicts Elise associates with. My men spotted Elise 2 days ago buying heroin from a dealer on 145th Street, and they saw her carrying a baby. The baby looked, neglected Mamie, dirty, too thin, like she's not being fed properly or cared for properly. It's a curse to let a child grow up in those conditions. It's a curse that I'm letting my own granddaughter suffer because I can't reach her mother. Mamie listened carefully, taking Bumpy's hand in hers. Although Elise wasn't Mamie's biological daughter, Elise was from Bumpy's first marriage, Mamie understood how deeply Bumpy loved his daughter and how devastated he was by Elise's addiction and estrangement. "Bumpy, we have to find them," Mamie said firmly. "We have to bring Elise home, get her into treatment, and make sure Margaret is safe. I know Elise won't want to come. I know she'll fight us. But we can't let that baby suffer because of her mother's addiction. Margaret deserves better than that." Bumpy nodded, wiping his eyes again. "I'm going to find them, Mamie. Tomorrow I'm putting every man I have on finding Elise and Margaret. And when we find them, I'm bringing them both home, whether Elise wants to come or not. I won't let my granddaughter starve like that little girl Keisha was starving. I won't let Margaret die because I was too slow to save her." At 9:15 a.m. on Friday, June 13, 1952, Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual booth at Small's Paradise Restaurant on 7th Avenue, eating breakfast while reading the New York Times. He'd spent the night barely sleeping, thinking about Elise and Margaret, planning how to find them and how to help them once he did. He turned to page 7 of the Times, scanning through local news stories, when a headline caught his eye and made his blood run cold. "Mother and child found dead in Harlem apartment, heroin overdose suspected." Johnson's hands began shaking as he read the article. Police discovered the bodies of an unidentified woman, approximately 25-30 years old, and her infant daughter, approximately 3-4 weeks old, in a fourth-floor apartment on West 143rd Street yesterday evening. Preliminary investigation suggests the mother died of a heroin overdose. The infant appears to have died of malnutrition and neglect, with no evidence of food or proper care in the apartment. Police are working to identify the victims and locate any family members. According to witnesses at Small's Paradise that morning, Bumpy Johnson stood up so fast he knocked his coffee cup over, his face going white, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. His bodyguard, Marcus Big Sam Jackson, rushed to Johnson's side as Johnson stumbled, nearly falling, catching himself on the table. "Mr. Johnson, what's wrong?" Jackson asked urgently. Johnson couldn't speak. He just pointed at the newspaper article with a shaking finger, and Jackson read it quickly. "Oh, God," Jackson said. "But, Mr. Johnson, it says unidentified. It might not be Elise. It might not be Margaret. Or it might be," Johnson said, his voice breaking. 143rd Street. That's where Elise was last seen. Fourth-floor apartment. That matches the information our men gathered. Mother, late 20s. That's Elise. Infant, 3-4 weeks old. That's Margaret. It's them, Sam. It's my daughter and my granddaughter, and they're dead because I was too slow to save them." Johnson pushed past Jackson and stumbled out of Small's Paradise onto 7th Avenue, where his driver, Quick Davis, was waiting with the Cadillac. Johnson grabbed Davis by the shoulder, speaking rapidly. "Quick, call every man we have. Find my daughter Elise right now. Find her and find my granddaughter Margaret. Search every apartment, every street corner, every heroin den in Harlem. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. Find them, now, before it's too late. Please, God, let it not be too late already." Davis immediately got on the car's radio, calling Johnson's lieutenants, ordering the organization's entire network to drop everything and focus on finding Elise Johnson and baby Margaret. Within 30 minutes, approximately 50 of Johnson's men were searching Harlem, checking locations where heroin addicts congregated, asking dealers if they'd seen Elise, showing photographs to people on the streets. Bumpy Johnson spent those hours pacing back and forth on the sidewalk outside Small's Paradise, still holding the newspaper with the article about the dead mother and child, praying quietly to God, something witnesses say they'd never heard Johnson do before. "Please, God, have mercy," Johnson kept repeating. "Please let them be alive. Please give me one more chance to save them. I'll do anything. Just please let them be alive." From 9:30 a.m. to 12:45 p.m. on June 13, 1952, Bumpy Johnson experienced what he would later describe as the worst 3 hours of his life. Worse than any prison sentence, worse than any gang war, worse than any beating or threat he'd ever endured. Every 15 minutes, one of Johnson's men would radio back with an update. "No sign of Elise on 145th Street. Checked 3 heroin dens on Amsterdam Avenue. No one's seen her. Dealers say they haven't seen her today." Each negative report deepened Johnson's despair, making him more convinced that the bodies found on 143rd Street were his daughter and granddaughter. Mr. Johnson was completely destroyed during those 3 hours, Davis recalls. "I'd never seen him like that. He couldn't eat, couldn't sit still, kept praying and crying and reading that newspaper article over and over. He kept saying, 'I failed them. I failed my daughter and my granddaughter. I knew Elise needed help, and I didn't act fast enough.'" It was heartbreaking watching this strong man, this man who'd survived everything Harlem could throw at him, falling apart because he thought his family was dead. At 12:43 p.m., Davis's radio crackled with a message from Robert Chen, one of Johnson's men who was searching the area near 147th Street and 8th Avenue. "Quick, this is Chen. I found her. I found Elise Johnson. She's alive. She's on the corner of 147th and 8th, and she's in bad shape, quick. Real bad. Severely intoxicated, dirty, begging some dealers for heroin, but she's alive. And I don't see a baby with her, but she's alive." Davis immediately relayed this to Johnson, whose face transformed from despair to intense relief, mixed with renewed fear. "She's alive," Johnson said, tears now flowing freely down his face. "Thank God, she's alive. Quick, take me there. Now, right now." The drive from Small's Paradise to 147th and 8th took less than 10 minutes. When they arrived, Johnson saw his daughter for the first time in 2 years, and what he saw nearly broke him again. Elise Johnson was sitting on the curb, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. Her hair matted and dirty, her face gaunt from malnutrition and drug abuse, her arms showing track marks from injections. She was talking to 2 men. Heroin dealers, Johnson recognized them immediately, begging them for drugs, promising she'd pay them later, desperate and incoherent. Johnson got out of the Cadillac and walked slowly toward his daughter, Chen and Davis following close behind in case the dealers caused trouble. But the dealers saw Johnson approaching. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson, and they quickly backed away, not wanting confrontation with someone that powerful. "Elise," Johnson said softly, kneeling down beside his daughter on the curb. Elise looked up at him with eyes that were unfocused and confused, not immediately recognizing her own father. Who are you?" Elise mumbled. "It's me, sweetheart," Johnson said, his voice breaking. "It's your father. It's Daddy." Elise stared at him for several seconds, and then recognition slowly came into her eyes. "Daddy? Why are you here?" "I'm here to help you, baby," Johnson said. "I'm here to take care of you. But first, I need you to tell me something very important. Where do you live now? Where's your apartment?" Elise tried to speak, but her mouth was too dry, her words incomprehensible. Johnson pulled a bottle of water from his car, helped Elise drink slowly, and asked again, "Where do you live, Elise? Where's your apartment? Please, baby, I need to know." Elise's hand rose shakily, pointing down 147th Street toward a building 2 blocks away. "There! 2nd building, 3rd floor. And the baby?" Johnson asked urgently. "Elise, where's the baby? Where's Margaret?" Elise's face showed confusion, as if she was struggling to remember what Johnson was talking about. Then clarity came briefly into her drugged eyes. "Margaret, She's at the apartment, with the others. Johnson didn't wait to hear more. He ran, actually ran, something the 47-year-old criminal rarely did, toward the building Elise had pointed to, taking stairs 2 at a time to reach the 3rd floor, Chen and Davis right behind him. The apartment door was unlocked. Johnson pushed it open and found himself in what he would later describe as a scene from hell. 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all in various states of drug intoxication, sprawled around a filthy one-room apartment that reeked of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste. Empty liquor bottles, drug paraphernalia, and garbage covered every surface. There was no furniture except a single mattress on the floor and a few broken chairs. And in the corner, lying in a cardboard box with a dirty blanket, was a tiny baby, approximately 3 weeks old, Margaret Johnson, Bumpy's granddaughter. "Oh, my God," Johnson whispered, rushing to the box and carefully picking up the baby. Margaret was alive, but in terrible condition. She was severely underweight. Her diaper hadn't been changed in what looked like days. Her skin showed signs of dehydration and malnutrition. She wasn't crying, didn't seem to have the energy to cry, just lay limply in Johnson's arms, barely responsive. According to Chen, who witnessed Johnson discovering his granddaughter, Johnson stood there holding Margaret with tears streaming down his face, looking around at the apartment where his granddaughter had been living, seeing the addicts who'd been caring for her while her mother was out begging for drugs. "This is what I let happen," Johnson said quietly. "This is what I allowed by not finding Elise sooner. My granddaughter nearly died in a cardboard box surrounded by addicts while I was running my business empire. What kind of grandfather am I? What kind of father?" "Mr. Johnson, we found her in time," Chen said. "She's alive. We can get her medical care, get her healthy, give her a proper home. We saved her." Johnson nodded, wrapping Margaret more securely in his arms. "Yes, we saved her. Thank God we saved her. But from now on, I'm never letting anything like this happen again. Margaret is going to grow up safe and loved and cared for. That's a promise I'm making to her right now." Johnson turned to Davis. "Quick, go get Elise from where we left her. Bring her here, and call Dr. Williams. Tell him I need him to meet us at my apartment immediately to examine a baby who's been severely neglected. Then send someone to get Mamie. Tell her we found Margaret and we're bringing her home." Within 20 minutes, Johnson had his daughter and granddaughter in his Cadillac, heading toward his Edgecombe Avenue apartment. Elise was barely conscious in the front passenger seat. Margaret was in Johnson's arms in the back, wrapped in his jacket because she'd been shivering from fever despite the June heat. For the next 3 days, June 13th through June 16th, 1952, Bumpy Johnson attempted what his associates told him was impossible: keeping his heroin-addicted daughter in his apartment long enough to get her into treatment while simultaneously caring for his critically ill granddaughter who needed immediate medical attention. Dr. Samuel Williams, a black physician who'd worked with Johnson's organization for years, examined Margaret on the evening of June 13th and delivered a grim assessment. "This baby is severely malnourished and dehydrated. She's probably been underfed since birth. She needs to be hospitalized immediately. If she'd gone another 48 hours without intervention, she likely would have died. As it is, she needs weeks of careful medical care and proper nutrition to recover." Johnson authorized whatever medical care was necessary, and Dr. Williams arranged for a private nurse to stay at Johnson's apartment around the clock, caring for Margaret while Johnson tried to help his daughter. But Elise Johnson was in the grip of heroin addiction so severe that staying in her father's apartment, even with her newborn daughter there, even with her father begging her to get clean, was torture. The physical withdrawal symptoms began within hours. sweating, shaking, vomiting, severe pain in her muscles and joints. And worse than the physical symptoms were the psychological cravings, the desperate, overwhelming need for heroin that made Elise scream and cry and beg her father to either let her leave or bring her drugs. Those 3 days were hell for everyone involved, Mamie Johnson later told close friends. Elise was going through withdrawal, and it was horrible to watch. She'd be coherent for a few minutes, would hold baby Margaret and cry about what a terrible mother she'd been, would promise to get clean and be better. And then the cravings would hit, and she'd become a completely different person, screaming at us to let her leave, threatening to hurt herself if we didn't give her money for drugs, saying awful things to Bumpy about how he'd ruined her life. It broke Bumpy's heart watching his daughter suffer like that. On June 15th, the third day of this impossible situation, one of Johnson's men who'd been stationed outside the apartment to prevent Elise from leaving reported to Johnson that he was genuinely afraid Elise might hurt baby Margaret during one of her withdrawal episodes. Elise had apparently picked up Margaret while the nurse was briefly out of the room and had held the baby near an open window while muttering incoherently. The guard had intervened before anything happened, but the incident made clear that keeping Elise and Margaret in the same apartment while Elise was going through severe withdrawal was dangerous for everyone involved. On the evening of June 15, 1952, Bumpy Johnson met with Malcolm Little, not yet known as Malcolm X, but already working as a minister with the Nation of Islam and operating rehabilitation programs for drug addicts in Harlem. Johnson and Malcolm had known each other for several years, had mutual respect despite coming from very different backgrounds, and had occasionally worked together on community improvement projects. "I need your advice." "Malcolm," Johnson said at the beginning of their meeting at a Lenox Avenue restaurant, "I need your help. Even my own daughter is in trouble, and I'm watching her destroy herself and nearly destroy her baby, and I don't know what to do." Johnson explained the entire situation: Elise's addiction, Margaret's near death in the cardboard box, the 3 impossible days trying to care for both of them simultaneously, the fear that Elise might hurt the baby during withdrawal. Malcolm listened carefully, occasionally nodding, his face showing deep sympathy for Johnson's situation. "Brother Bumpy," Malcolm said when Johnson finished explaining, "I understand your pain. I've lost people I love to addiction. I've watched drugs destroy families, destroy communities. The heroin that's flooding Harlem right now is a weapon being used to destroy black people, and your daughter is one of its victims." "Can you help her?" Johnson asked. "Can your rehabilitation program help someone as far gone as Elise is?" "I have space in the rehabilitation center I run through the temple," Malcolm said. "We've successfully treated heroin addicts who were as badly addicted as your daughter sounds. Our approach is holistic, physical detoxification combined with spiritual renewal, giving addicts a sense of purpose and community that replaces the drugs. It's not easy. Many who try to get clean fail, but some succeed. Your daughter deserves a chance to be one of those who succeed." "And Margaret?" Johnson asked. "My granddaughter, she needs constant medical care right now, and she can't be around her mother while her mother is going through withdrawal and rehabilitation." "Bring your daughter to the rehab center," Malcolm suggested. "We'll provide the intensive care she needs to get clean. And you and your wife can care for Margaret while your daughter is in treatment. When your daughter is healthy enough to be a proper mother, if she can achieve that health, then you can reunite them. But for now, they need to be separated for both their safety and their health." Johnson felt tears forming again, the third time in 4 days that he'd cried, something that would have been unthinkable before June 12th, when that little girl, Keisha, had approached his car. "Thank you, Malcolm. Johnson said quietly. "Thank you for giving my daughter a chance I didn't know how to give her. I'll bring her to your center tomorrow, and I'll pay for her treatment. Whatever it costs, I'll pay it." "We don't charge for our services, Brother Bumpy," Malcolm said. "We're not doing this for money. We're doing this because black people need to help each other, need to fight together against the forces destroying our communities. Your money is welcome as a donation to support the program, but it's not required. Your daughter will be treated because she's a black woman who deserves help, not because her father can afford to pay." That night, Bumpy Johnson explained the plan to Elise during one of her brief, coherent moments. Elise cried, said she was scared, said she didn't want to be separated from Margaret, but also admitted she knew she couldn't care for Margaret properly in her current condition. "I'm a terrible mother," Elise sobbed. "Margaret deserves better than me." "Margaret deserves a healthy mother," Johnson corrected gently, "and you deserve a chance to become that healthy mother. Go to Malcolm's Rehabilitation Center, get clean, learn to be healthy again, and when you're ready, Margaret will be here waiting for you. Mamie and I will take care of her until you can take care of her yourself. But you have to do the work, Elise. You have to want to get clean badly enough to do the hard work of recovery." Elise nodded, still crying. "I'll try, Daddy. I promise I'll try." On Monday morning, June 16, 1952, Bumpy Johnson drove his daughter to the Nation of Islam's Rehabilitation Center in Harlem, where Malcolm Little and a team of counselors were waiting to admit her to their intensive treatment program. Before entering the center, Elise asked to hold Margaret one more time. Mamie brought the baby, who'd gained 1/2 pound in 3 days of proper feeding and medical care and who was beginning to look healthier, and placed her in Elise's arms. "I love you, Margaret," Elise whispered to her daughter. "I'm sorry I didn't take better care of you. I'm going to get better so I can be the mother you deserve. I promise." Margaret, 3 weeks old, too young to understand words but perhaps responding to her mother's voice, made a small cooing sound. Elise kissed her daughter's forehead gently, then handed her back to Mamie before walking into the rehabilitation center without looking back, tears streaming down her face. Johnson stood watching the door close behind his daughter, holding Margaret in his arms now, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on him. "We're going to take care of this little girl," Johnson said to Mamie quietly. "We're going to give her everything she needs while her mother gets healthy. And we're going to pray that Elise succeeds in getting clean so she can come home to her daughter. That's all we can do now." Mamie nodded, taking Johnson's free hand and squeezing it gently. "We'll get through this, Bumpy. Our family will get through this." For the next 18 months, from June 1952 through December 1953, Bumpy and Mamie Johnson essentially raised their granddaughter, Margaret, while Elise underwent treatment at Malcolm's Rehabilitation Center. The treatment was long and difficult. Detoxification took weeks, followed by months of counseling, spiritual development, and learning to live without drugs. Elise suffered multiple relapses during treatment, but Malcolm's program was persistent, always taking her back, always giving her another chance. Meanwhile, baby Margaret grew from a severely malnourished newborn into a healthy, happy toddler under her grandparents' care. Bumpy Johnson, one of Harlem's most feared criminals, became utterly devoted to his granddaughter, spending hours playing with her, feeding her, teaching her to walk and talk. Watching Bumpy with baby Margaret was something special, Davis recalls. This tough guy, this man who'd survived prison and gang wars and police persecution, would sit on the floor for hours, playing peekaboo with his granddaughter, making funny faces to make her laugh, singing to her at bedtime. Margaret transformed Bumpy in ways nothing else had. She made him softer, more patient, more willing to show emotion. She made him realize he had something to protect that was more valuable than any criminal empire. By March 1953, Margaret was 9 months old and beginning to say her first words. Mamie would later recall that Margaret's first clear word was "Mama," which she said looking at a photograph of Elise that Bumpy kept on his dresser. But her second word, the word that would devastate Bumpy just weeks later, came in late, April 1953. "Pop," Margaret said clearly, looking directly at Bumpy while he held her. "Pop." Johnson had tears in his eyes immediately. His granddaughter had just called him Pop, a name that meant grandfather, a name that acknowledged the role he'd been playing in her life for nearly a year, a name that made him family in the most fundamental way. "That's right, sweetheart," Johnson said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your Pop, and I'm always going to be here for you, always." But even as he said those words, Bumpy Johnson knew they might not be true, because in May 1953 he was scheduled to stand trial on federal narcotics conspiracy charges that would likely send him to prison, possibly to Alcatraz, the maximum security federal prison in San Francisco Bay, from which almost no one ever escaped, and where he might spend the next 10 years of his life, missing Margaret's entire childhood. On May 18, 1953, Bumpy Johnson was convicted in federal court on charges of conspiracy to distribute narcotics. The evidence against him was substantial. Years of FBI investigation had documented his involvement in Harlem's drug trade, and multiple witnesses testified about his role in organizing heroin distribution networks. On June 3, 1953, Judge Harold Medina sentenced Johnson to 15 years in federal prison to be served at the United States Penitentiary Alcatraz, effective immediately. Johnson's attorney, Theodore Green, argued for a lesser sentence, pointing out Johnson's age, 48 years old, his clean record for the past several years, and his family circumstances, specifically that he was caring for his infant granddaughter while his daughter underwent addiction treatment. But Judge Medina was unmoved. "Mr. Johnson, you have built a criminal empire that has poisoned Harlem with narcotics for decades. The fact that your own daughter became addicted to heroin, the very substance you've helped distribute, shows the devastating consequences of your chosen profession. You ask for leniency because you're caring for your granddaughter, but your granddaughter exists in these circumstances precisely because of the drugs you helped spread through Harlem. You will serve 15 years at Alcatraz. Perhaps that time will give you opportunity to reflect on the damage you've caused." Johnson was remanded to federal custody immediately following sentencing. He was allowed one final visit with family before being transported to California. On June 5, 1953, 2 days after his sentencing, Bumpy Johnson sat in a prison visiting room at the Manhattan Correctional Center, holding his granddaughter Margaret for what he knew would be the last time in many years. Margaret was 11 months old, just beginning to walk on wobbly legs, just beginning to form sentences of 2 or 3 words. She looked at her grandfather with complete trust and love, unaware that he was about to disappear from her life for years. "Pop," Margaret said, reaching up to touch Bumpy's face. "Pop." Johnson held his granddaughter close, tears flowing freely now, not caring who saw him cry. "I love you, Margaret," Johnson whispered. "Pop loves you so much. I have to go away for a while, a long while, but I want you to remember that Pop will always love you, and someday I'll come back. I promise. Someday I'll come back and we'll be together again." Mamie Johnson sat beside her husband, crying silently, reaching over to touch Margaret's hand. "We'll take care of her, Bumpy," Mamie said. "I'll raise her like she's our daughter. And when Elise gets out of treatment and gets healthy, Elise can be her mother again. But until you come home, I'll make sure Margaret knows who her Pop is. I'll show her your picture every day. I'll tell her stories about you. She won't forget you." The guard announced visiting time was over. Johnson kissed Margaret's forehead one final time, handed her to Mamie, and stood up to leave. As he walked toward the door that would take him away from his family, he heard Margaret's voice one last time. "Pop! Pop!" Johnson turned and waved, forcing himself to smile through his tears, and then the door closed behind him and he was gone. Bumpy Johnson arrived at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary on June 15, 1953, and was assigned to Cell Block B, Cell 184. For the next 10 years, until his release in November 1963, Johnson would spend most of his waking hours thinking about his granddaughter Margaret, wondering how she was growing up without him, praying that she was safe and healthy and happy. Mamie wrote to Bumpy weekly, including photographs of Margaret and updates about her development. July 1953. "Margaret is walking now, Bumpy. She walks everywhere, always moving, always exploring. She still says 'Pop' constantly. We show her your photograph every day, and she points at it and says your name." December 1953. "Margaret had her first birthday last month. She's such a beautiful child. Bumpy. She has your eyes and your smile. We had a small party for her. She ate cake and laughed so hard. I wish you could have been here." June 1954. "Good news, Bumpy. Elise completed her treatment at Malcolm Center. She's been clean for 9 months now. She's living with us, and she's learning to be a proper mother to Margaret. It's slow. She missed Margaret's first year, and they're still building their relationship, but she's trying hard. Margaret calls her Mama now and calls me Nana, but she still asks for Pop every night before bed. We tell her you'll come home someday." April 1957. "Margaret is almost 4 years old now, Bumpy. She's so smart, so curious about everything. She starts school in September. Elise is doing well. She's been clean for nearly 4 years, working at a legitimate job, being a good mother. I think your daughter is finally healthy, Bumpy. I think you'll be proud of her when you come home." November 1960. "Margaret is 7 years old now. She's in 2nd grade, getting excellent marks. She asks about you all the time, wants to know when you're coming home, what prison is like, whether you're safe. We tell her you're coming home soon. Only 3 more years, Bumpy. 3 more years and you can see your granddaughter again." Johnson kept every letter, every photograph, pinned them on his cell wall where he could see Margaret's face every day. Other prisoners at Alcatraz would later recall that Johnson talked about his granddaughter constantly, showed her pictures to anyone who'd look, counted down the days until his release when he could see her again. Bumpy lived for those letters from his wife, says another Alcatraz prisoner who served time with Johnson and who spoke with the Gazette in 1968. Every week when mail came, Bumpy would be waiting anxiously to see if there was a letter from Mamie, if there were new pictures of Margaret. And when letters arrived, Bumpy would sit in his cell, reading them over and over, sometimes crying, always smiling at the pictures of this little girl who was growing up without him. That granddaughter kept Bumpy sane during 10 years at Alcatraz. She gave him reason to survive, reason to stay disciplined, reason to count every day, because every day was one day closer to seeing her again. On November 16, 1963, Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary after serving 10 years and 5 months of his 15-year sentence, released early for good behavior. He flew from San Francisco to New York, arriving at Idlewild Airport, now JFK Airport, at 6:30 p.m., where Mamie was waiting for him. "Where's Margaret?" Johnson asked immediately after hugging his wife. "Is she here? Can I see her?" "She's at home with Elise," Mamie said, smiling at her husband's eagerness. "She's 10 years old now, Bumpy. She's beautiful and smart, and so excited to finally meet her pop in person instead of just in photographs and letters. She's been counting down the days just like you have. The drive from the airport to the Edgecombe Avenue apartment felt endless to Johnson. 10 years and 5 months since he'd held his granddaughter. 10 years and 5 months since he'd heard her call him Pop in that visiting room. Margaret had been 11 months old when he left. Now she was 10 years old, a child he'd never really known, who'd grown up entirely during his imprisonment. When they arrived at the apartment, Johnson's hands were shaking as he walked up the stairs. Mamie opened the door, and there in the living room stood two people Johnson barely recognized. Elise Johnson, 39 years old now, healthy and clean after 10 years of sobriety, looking more like the daughter Bumpy remembered from before heroin had destroyed her. And Margaret Johnson, 10 years old, wearing a pretty blue dress, her hair in neat braids, holding a homemade Welcome Home Pop sign that she'd painted herself, her face showing nervous excitement at finally meeting the grandfather she'd only known through photographs and letters and stories. For several seconds, everyone stood frozen, and then Margaret spoke in a voice that was quiet but clear. "Pop? Is that you? Is that really you?" Johnson felt tears streaming down his face. Again, the tough criminal crying because his granddaughter had just called him Pop after 10 years of separation. "It's me, sweetheart," Johnson managed to say. "It's Pop. I'm home." Margaret dropped her sign and ran across the room, throwing her arms around Johnson's waist, hugging him with all the strength her 10-year-old body could manage. "I missed you so much, Pop," Margaret said, crying now too. "I looked at your picture every single day, and Nana told me stories about you, and I counted down the days until you came home, and now you're finally here, and I love you so much." Johnson knelt down so he was at Margaret's eye level, hugged her properly, looked at her face, seeing his own eyes looking back at him, seeing the beautiful child his granddaughter had become during his decade in Alcatraz. "I love you too, Margaret," Johnson said, not even trying to control his tears anymore. "I thought about you every single day I was gone. You were the reason I survived. You were the reason I made it through. And now I'm home, and I'm never leaving you again. That's a promise from Pop to his granddaughter. I'm never leaving you again." Margaret pulled back slightly, looked at her grandfather's face, studied the tears on his cheeks, and then said something that made everyone in the room cry. "Dad! You're my dad now, Pop. Not just Pop. You're my dad, because you were there even when you weren't here. You were always my dad, okay?" Johnson couldn't speak. He just nodded and held his granddaughter while Mamie and Elise watched, both of them crying too, both understanding that this moment, this reunion between a grandfather and the granddaughter he'd saved from a cardboard box 10 years earlier, was what family meant in its purest, most essential form. Later, that evening, after Margaret had finally gone to bed, still talking excitedly about having her Pop home, Johnson sat with Mamie and Elise in their living room, and Elise said something she'd been wanting to say for 10 years. "Thank you, Daddy. Thank you for saving Margaret. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for never giving up on us even when we gave you every reason to give up. I've been clean for 10 years because you gave me a chance when nobody else would. Margaret is alive and healthy because you found her before it was too late. I know I can never repay what you did for us, but I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life being the mother Margaret deserves and being the daughter you deserve. That's my promise to you." Johnson looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years, seeing the healthy woman she'd become instead of the heroin addict she'd been, and smiled. "You already are, Elise. You already are." Bumpy Johnson lived 5 more. Years after his release from Alcatraz, dying of a heart attack on July 7, 1968, at age 62. During those 5 years, he spent as much time as possible with his granddaughter, Margaret, watching her grow from a 10-year-old child into a 15-year-old young woman, making up for the decade he'd missed while imprisoned. But Johnson never forgot June 12, 1952, the day a hungry little girl named Keisha Williams had approached his car asking for help, the day Johnson had cried because seeing that child's desperation made him realize his own granddaughter was in similar danger, the day that had started the chain of events leading to Margaret's rescue. The Williams family, Keisha and her mother, received Johnson's support for 2 full years, as he'd promised. Rent paid, food provided, mother employed, child safe. Keisha Williams grew up to become a teacher in Harlem public schools, and she would later tell her own students about the day she met Bumpy Johnson and how his kindness had saved her family. Mr. Johnson gave us a chance to survive when we had nothing, Keisha Williams said in a 1985 interview. My mother and I would have been homeless, might have died if Mr. Johnson hadn't helped us, but what I didn't know then, what I only learned years later, was that helping us had helped him too. My hunger showed him that his own granddaughter was hungry. My desperation showed him that his granddaughter was in danger. By asking for his help, I inadvertently saved another child's life, a child I never met but who also wouldn't have survived without Mr. Johnson's intervention. So in a strange way, my mother and I and Margaret Johnson all saved each other that day. My desperation saved Margaret. Margaret's danger motivated Mr. Johnson to help us, and Mr. Johnson's kindness saved all of us. Margaret Johnson grew up to become a successful woman, graduating from college, becoming a social worker who helped troubled families in Harlem, carrying on the legacy of helping others that her pop had demonstrated when he saved her from that cardboard box. She would tell people that June 13th, 1952, the day her pop found her in that apartment and carried her to safety, was her real birthday, the day her life actually began. And she would tell them about the last words her pop said to her before he died in July 1968, words that summed up everything he'd learned from that little girl approaching his car in June 1952, everything he'd learned from saving his granddaughter, everything he'd learned about what really mattered in life. Margaret, I spent my whole life building a criminal empire, making money, gaining power, surviving gang wars and prison sentences. But none of that matters compared to you. Saving you was the only thing I did in my entire life that was truly worth doing. Taking care of you was the only time I was actually a good man instead of just a successful criminal. Remember that, sweetheart. Remember that the most important thing anyone can do is protect the children who need protection. That's the only thing that really matters. That's the only legacy worth leaving. That was June 12th, 1952. That was the little girl who made Bumpy Johnson cry. That was the day everything changed, because one hungry child asked for help, and that request saved 2 children's lives and reminded a hardened criminal what it meant to be a good man.